Now that Trump is president again, there are a lot of questions about what is going to happen next. Let's get to them. Is there any realistic prospect of a peace deal in 100 days, or is this infeasible due to remaining bargaining frictions being unresolved? Well, I don't think 24 hours was a reasonable suggested time frame. 100 days, I think, is a little bit more reasonable. But a lot of that depends on just how much Trump is willing to offer and then withhold, depending on whether Ukraine and Russia individually sign up for whatever it is that's put onto the peace plan. And there's a lot of question marks about exactly what that looks like. We have talked before about Donald Trump's special envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg's peace plan. I'm going to be talking about that again on the main channel later this week, so look for that. There are lots of issues that are going to come up with trying to implement a plan of the design that Keith Kellogg has. I think, by and large, to Kellogg's credit, the peace plan is well grounded in the theory of war. And so from a practical perspective, it is very much possible that something like this could happen, where a peace deal that looks like that could be implemented, and it could be within 100 days. I don't think that's completely crazy. But there are all sorts of other things that could pop up, and that's going to be the focus of the video later this week on the main channel. There are all sorts of things that could pop up in the meantime that will, as this question is suggesting, represent bargaining frictions and other sorts of implementation issues that might make it difficult. So I would not be optimistic that the war is going to be ending in the next 100 days if I were the Trump administration. There's also a lot of details that are missing from the peace plan about what exactly the line is going to look like that is going to be drawn between Ukraine and Russia, how it's going to be enforced after the fact. And those details matter a great deal to actually having a signature being put on the bottom line. So is there a realistic prospect of a peace deal in 100 days? I do think so. I would personally bet against it, and you'll learn more about that later this week on the main channel. In the vein of, don't listen to what leaders say, watch what they do. What are Trump's real policies and priorities? At least as it relates to international relations. If I had to summarize it in one word, it would be China. We're going to be hearing about China a lot over the next 4 years. And I think as a broader exercise for ourselves, whenever we hear about something in the news as it relates to Trump and international relations, whether it is involving China directly or not, think about the consequences of that particular behavior for China. And again, maybe this is a second-order consequence. Maybe we're thinking about this as the Russia-Ukraine deal or no deal. How does that affect as a second-order consequence of China? And answering that question might give you a better mindset for what Trump's mindset is, or Trump's foreign policy team's mindset is on the subject matter, which may then help you better interpret what's going on and why something is or is not happening. Will Trump's second presidency lead to an increase in global peace or an increase in global conflict? I think the answer to that question is indeterminate for a couple of reasons. One is because we are currently living in a world with relatively high conflict levels, especially when compared to the historical average, especially when compared to the post-Cold War historical average. And as a consequence of that, it would be very easy for a president to come into office and then literally do nothing for 4 years, and for global conflict levels on average to decline, not obviously because of anything that the president did, but rather because we are just regressing back toward the mean. Now, the other part of this, I think where the question is coming from, is the idea that Trump has this reputation for being more belligerent than the average president, or Joe Biden specifically, and that may play into things on the global stage. Well, the other reason why I think answering this question is hard and why it's indeterminate given what we know from an outsider's perspective, not being able to look at all of the conflicts at once right now and understand what is causing conflict or what could potentially be causing conflict in all of those different areas. The big issue here is that what I have learned over the course of my academic career, and in fact is a recurring subject in the textbook that I have for graduate level education on this subject, is that basic relationships between what you think would be something that is likely to cause war and the actual probability of war when you work through the strategic models, it often doesn't come out the way that you think it would. It is possible, for example, and I've talked about this previously on the main channel, for you to increase the cost of war and increase the probability of war, which is strange because you would think that if war is becoming less attractive, you would have a lower probability of war. And there's something similar there with levels of belligerency, where you can increase an actor's level of belligerency and yet decrease the probability of war. And I don't want to give the full explanation for that because that would be a full 10-minute video if I really wanted to do that. But the basic idea is that there are some sets of assumptions under which if you increase, for example, an actor's level of belligerency, the way that gets internalized by the opponent is to decrease demands further down than the amount that the increased level of belligerency by the first actor is going to increase their demands. So one party increases their demands because of a higher level of belligerency, but the other side decreases their demands by an even larger amount due to the other side's belligerency. And as a result, it's hard to say just because one actor, President Trump versus President Biden, just because President Trump might be more belligerent or has a reputation for more belligerency, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see an increase in global conflict. So to answer this question again, it's indeterminate. I would have to look at this at a situation-by-situation case to be able to tell you something intelligent about that particular situation. And trying to aggregate 200-something possible conflicts into one single question is just not something that's feasible to do. I know Trump has made a lot of promises he will fulfill on his first day in office. Many of them are not feasible, and he and his team have begun to backtrack on some of them. How could this affect him during these 4 years, and could this affect the 2028 election? Well, given that Trump is a lame duck president and can't run for re-election in 2028 due to the constitutional term limits that the United States has, I don't think Trump is particularly concerned about this, with one major caveat to that statement, which is that there will be midterm elections in 2026. So in November of 2026, every single member of the House of Representatives will be up for re-election, as well as about a third of the Senate. Historically speaking, the president's party tends to do very poorly in those types of midterm elections. And insofar as anyone remembers that Trump had made some promises over the first, say, 90 days of his presidency from January to April of 2025, insofar as anyone remembers that in November of 2026, that obviously will be bad for Republicans trying to run for re-election or challenge Democrats who are currently sitting in those seats. Now, for 2028, again, because Trump can't run for re-election, the primary person that this is going to harm is J.D. Vance. I actually looked at this right before I started to record. Vance is, unsurprisingly, the most likely Republican nominee on the betting markets at about 43.5%. He probably is not going to be particularly happy about things that Trump has promised and is going to be unable to deliver in the time frame that Trump has said previously. But that's, again, a question for November of 2028. And by and large, American voters don't really think too much about what happened in the first year of a president's term in office, or in this case, the party's term in office. If we're thinking about this with J.D. Vance and Trump. They're not going to be thinking too much about the second year either. They're going to be focusing on what's going on mostly about that third year and into the fourth year of the presidency. So again, insofar as anyone remembers, it's going to be bad for Vance, but at the same time, probably not very many people are going to be thinking about that come November 2028. Any thoughts on Trump's threats on Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal? Also the alleged Republican plan to invade northern Mexico? Oh yeah, I have lots of thoughts about those things, especially as it relates to the purchase of Greenland. So many thoughts that you'll see me next week on the main channel talking about them. To give you a preview of what I'll be talking about specifically, I hear a lot of commentary online about how it's impossible for Trump to purchase Greenland. That's just not true. It is very much possible to purchase Greenland, but in practice, it's almost certainly not going to happen. But you'll have to wait till next week for the details on those sorts of things. Probably a less immediately interesting question. What do you think happens should Trump die in office? I doubt he will, but people just suddenly getting sick and dying at 80 isn't completely out of the ordinary either. I've seen a lot of speculation and predictions about what Trump will do in Ukraine, Greenland, domestically, and so forth, but very little of what would President Vance do. I suspect a recurring theme that we're going to be seeing in these questions that's important for the answers is the fact that MAGA candidates have not done well in elections where Trump was not on the ballot. So what I'm thinking about specifically here is the midterm election during Trump's first term, as well as the midterm elections during Joe Biden's presidency, and then special elections where maybe a senator needs to be replaced in a non-election season or a governor needs to be replaced in a non-election season, and you have a special election specifically for that sort of thing. Republicans have underperformed in those elections, especially when you're looking at MAGA-style Republicans, those that have aligned more specifically with Trump. So I think that's going to guide a lot of Republican behavior in how they interact with Trump during this presidency, given that Trump is not going to be on the ballot again. And they need to be cognizant of that when they are thinking about their sorts of election constraints. So what I would guess a President Vance would want to do here is to try to bridge that divide between the MAGA set of Republicans and the more traditional Republicans of, say, the George W. Bush era or the Mitt Romney style Republican. So I don't think he would be completely abandoning the sort of MAGA style of presidency and disposition more generally, because he's going to want to try to be the flag bearer for that group. But simultaneously, he is not Trump. There is, to some degree, some sort of Trump-specific effect of having Trump on the ballot, driving individuals to vote for MAGA-style Republicans, that J.D. Vance is not and will not have that support. And so he's going to, I would suspect, in that sort of circumstance, again, also want to speak to the traditional neoconservative Republican or Mitt Romney-style Republican, so that when he runs for re-election in 2028, he might have a broader coalition that will come together that other Republicans who are not named Donald Trump have been unable to do when having the MAGA-style Republicanism going into an election. Does game theory apply to somebody with the temperament of Trump? This is allowing me to go on a rant that I've wanted to go on for quite some time now. And actually, there's going to be two sub-rants on this. The first sub-rant is going to talk about using irrational actors inside of game theoretic models. And the other is going to be about how irrationality is often defined in a public setting versus how it works inside the models that we construct. Okay, first sub-rant. Using irrational actors inside of models. Let me give you the spoiler at the top, which is, yeah, you can do that. There's no problem with doing that. The longer answer, the longer explanation, is that in the construction of a model, all you are doing is having a set of rules about how individuals will behave inside of a strategic interaction, and then working through what those rules say about the outcome that is going to be the result of that strategic interaction. What that means is that in a normal setting, when we don't want to have irrationality be a part of the model, we're going to construct it so that the individuals are going to be thinking through their own preferences, the preferences of the other actors that are surrounding them, and they're going to work through what is the best way to maximize their own payoffs, their own outcomes, based on the strategic constraints in front of them and the information that they have available to them. That's your normal standard way of a strategic actor playing inside of a model. But all that is a set of rules that explains how that particular actor is going to act. If you want to allow for an irrational actor into a model, it's very easy. You just construct that actor with a different set of rules about how they are going to behave. Maybe at particular decisions, they are going to behave randomly or impulsively. Maybe they are going to actively ignore what is going to be best for the opponent in a particular situation and just presuppose for whatever reason, again, because they're irrational, that the second player is going to take a particular action even though that's not in that second actor's best interest. You can program that into a model and then work through what's going to happen as a result of that. So if this question is saying, hey, Trump has a bizarre temperament, maybe he's not strategic in the way that we normally think about strategic interactions, that doesn't actually prevent us from working through those sorts of things. We just have to make different assumptions about how individuals are going to act and then program that into the model. And it allows you to see how you might get different outcomes associated with that sort of thing. If you've ever heard about the madman theory, It turns out that there are often cases where it might be beneficial to behave irrationally to be able to get outcomes that you would be unable to obtain otherwise. Now, the second part of this, the second sub-rant, is the description of irrationality in a public setting versus how we think about this in a modeling setting. In a modeling setting, what strategic means is someone has an ability to write down a sensible preference ordering, and again, is going to try to maximize their outcomes along that preference ordering, given the other strategic constraints in front of them. What it doesn't mean is someone is behaving in a way that you or I would behave. So what I mean by that, and what I'm trying to get at with it, is that Trump just has different preferences than I think most politicians do. Take a generic normal president, quote unquote normal president, like Joe Biden. Trump's preferences are not going to be looking a lot like Biden's preferences. I think, broadly speaking, we would probably mostly agree that Trump has some sort of utility function which maximizes more toward the amount of attention that he receives in the news and how he is going to be perceived personally with his historical legacy in one way or another, as compared to perhaps your average politician who might be more interested in developing the institutions of the United States. And that does not make Trump irrational, that just puts a different weighting on his preference ordering. Similarly, during the initial part of the invasion, especially of Ukraine, but even prolonged since then, there's also this discussion about how Vladimir Putin is irrational because he is spending all sorts of costs trying to invade Ukraine. All sorts of lives are being lost. And that's not the type of thing that you or I may be willing to endure. And as a consequence, he's crazy, he's irrational. Well, again, that's just a different sort of preference ordering. If you and I don't place enough utility or value on parts of eastern Ukraine, then we're not going to be willing to pay costs associated with trying to capture eastern Ukraine. Putin might be, we're not, but that's just saying that, again, Putin has a different weighting on his preference ordering. And that does not make him irrational, that just makes him different, for whatever reason. So, to put all of this together, it is very easy to construct game theoretic models where you have actual crazy people involved in those models. You just make a different assumption about how those individuals are going to be acting. Or alternatively, the way that we normally construct a model with fully strategic actors, we'll just have some sort of variable that weighs how they care about one thing versus another thing. And as a result of having a variable there, we can solve a model that includes a situation where individuals have these Western-style preferences of not trying to acquire land or not placing a lot of direct value on land, and also simultaneously solve that same game for a situation where the individual who is the leader does have a lot of value placed on that land. And one of the benefits of doing it that way, of solving a single model with a variable that goes across that, is that you can observe the differences in what one individual would do with those Western-style preferences versus what another individual, maybe Vladimir Putin, might have with a preference that's placing a lot more value on that land. So, again, the one-sentence answer to this question is, it's very easy. Yes, you can do it. Is the perceived unpredictability of Trump and his cabinet's wide range of views on issues like Ukraine an advantage when it comes to negotiation? Will the blurring of American red lines compared to Biden lead to a more peaceful period? This is another one of those topics where there's a lot of discussion online that I think is misguided. Obviously, I am not the only person who speaks to how uncertainty and war interrelate. That's a topic that comes up in basically every introductory IR class at this point. So anyone who has a degree in international relations, or even political science, maybe they studied American politics more specifically, but they still took the intro class on international relations. A lot of people have some basic level of background on it, and seem to understand that if I don't know my opponent's bottom line, then that might cause me to demand more than what I can actually get away with. And when I make that onerous demand, my opponent rejects and we end up in war, and that's bad. So a lot of the commentary I've seen online about this subject matter is that Trump's unpredictability is very bad for the United States because that is going to result in some sort of miscalculation from the other side, and then we get war as a result, and that's bad for the United States or something like that. If you actually go deep into the models, that's not how it works. Not fully, anyway. It is true that You can inject uncertainty into situations and result in wars that you will not get otherwise. It's also true, though, and this is kind of getting back to that earlier point about everything being indeterminate inside of that crisis bargaining textbook. It's also true that there are other circumstances out there where you can increase uncertainty and decrease the probability of war. But putting that aside for a second, sure, okay, yes, it is true that increasing uncertainty under some circumstances can result in more war. And from a global efficiency perspective, that is a bad thing. But from the perspective of the individual that might have some sort of private information to themselves, the ability to maintain that private information and thereby be able to bluff will, on average, for that individual, result in welfare gains, again, for that individual. The reason being is that if I am a relatively weak and unresolved actor, and I had to be forced to reveal my private information and I no longer had the ability to bluff, then I am going to get a really bad outcome for myself because I am weak and I am unresolved. But if I have the ability to bluff, then some portion of the time I am going to pull the wool over the eyes of my opponent. My opponent is going to think I am resolved and powerful and then make concessions that really aren't due to me at that point because I'm in fact weak. But I can get away with it because you don't know that, and I can bluff that. The only situation where it's bad to have private information in that regard is if you truly are the very resolved and very powerful actor, and then you don't want to have the other side be incorrect in its assessment of you, because if you're the strong, resolved type, you get what you want through negotiations without having to fight, without having to pay any of those costs. So it's helpful for you under that circumstance if it were possible to freely and credibly reveal your information, because you would be able to get all of the concessions that you would want. The problem is, ex ante, you're not always the most resolved and most powerful actor in those sorts of situations. On average, you're going to be somewhere in between. Not the strongest, but not the weakest. And the ability sometimes to be able to bluff like you are the strongest is going to be beneficial to you. So on average, this would be an advantage in these sorts of negotiations. Doesn't always mean it's going to be a good thing, but on average, it would. Now, that comes with an extra caveat here, that uncertainty for the investment side of things. So thinking about businesses trying to decide what to do, where to place their money, where to invest. Businesses hate that type of uncertainty. And so there is going to be a weighing down of economic investment as a consequence of that will be inefficient for how the United States gets things done. And it's unclear exactly how that breaks, whether the security gains from the ability to bluff are better or worse than the amount that's going to be lost as a consequence of poor investment decisions because of that uncertainty, or alternatively, investments that are not made because the uncertainty is too bad. So purely from a security perspective, the unnuanced answer here for the first question is yes, and the unnuanced answer to the second question is no. How effective will Trump and the Republicans be at passing legislation? Will it be breakneck or tortoise-like? In the past election, Republicans took control of the House, Senate, and presidency. Likewise, it seems that the party is pretty lockstep with Trump. However, I wanted to know if you see any internal bargaining frictions or external frustrations placed on the party's ability to legislate. As a starting point, it will help if we go back 8 years to the beginning of Trump's first term in office. Back then, the Republicans had another clean sweep. Republicans controlled the House, Republicans controlled the Senate, and obviously Trump was in the Oval Office. Now, usually when you have a clean sweep like that, you would expect to see lots of legislation passed. The one real hang-up occurs in the Senate with the filibuster, but even aside from that, you would still think you would have lots and lots of votes take place that would be in line with the party's goals, and you'd see a lot more legislation happening than when you have a divided Congress, or Congress one way and the president going the other way, divided government more broadly speaking. But back then, you had lots of individuals inside of the House and the Senate not fully on board with MAGA. You still don't have that today, but obviously there has been a shift over the last 8 years with a greater Republican adoption of MAGA principles. So I don't think we're going to be looking at the same sort of situation as 8 years ago, where, for example, most publicly, you had John McCain, when it came to a vote on reforms to Obamacare, giving that thumbs down. I don't think we're going to see quite the level of that type of resistance inside of the House and Senate that we did, again, 8 years ago. But where it says here, likewise, it seems that the party is pretty lockstep with Trump. Going back to that earlier question that I had, I don't think that is fully true. I would not describe the party as lockstep with Trump, again, as a consequence of the electoral incentives and concerns that if Trump is not on the ballot, then full-blown MAGAism is not going to sell well to the voter base. And you can see that to some degree with the discussion surrounding the TikTok ban, where Donald Trump has come out saying he wants to delay it for 90 days, and you're already seeing Republicans in Congress saying, no, that's not what we voted on. That's not what the legislation that is law that has already been passed says, and we're not okay with this. And you'll see those sorts of divisions, I think, pop up as well. There is going to be plenty of independent thought among Republicans inside of the House and Senate on types of issues that might break away from more traditional Republican values that might have some nuance and specialness inside of Trump's mind and priorities that Trump has that the rest of the Republican Party does not have. So to condense this into one simplified answer, I suspect it will be better for Republicans than that first 2-year period, 2017 and 2018, in terms of passing legislation. But I don't think it's going to be a large clean sweep of legislation coming through that matches the clean sweep of the House, Senate, and Oval Office for Republicans. What dilemmas will the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance face with Tulsi Gabbard as the Director of National Intelligence? I think this one is straightforward. It does not matter whether Gabbard is or is not a Russian asset. What matters is whether others think she is or isn't, or have doubts about that. If 4 of the Five Eyes are concerned about that sort of thing, then 4 of the Five Eyes are going to be more reluctant to share particular pieces of intelligence, which has the straightforward down-the-line consequences. To be able to give you a full answer to this question, I would need to know what the intelligence assessments are of the other countries as it relates to Tulsi Gabbard, and as it turns out, they do not tell me those sorts of things, so I cannot give you a full answer to the question. Lines on maps for the TikTok kerfuffle? Yeah, I think that's going to be another topic for this secondary Lines on Maps extra channel, probably later this week. There are all sorts of issues with trying to not follow through with the ban for the businesses that are involved in it. So whatever's going on with Trump's 90-day delay, I am not optimistic that there is going to actually be a TikTok that is functioning in the next 90 days, absent a sale. Will Trump's desires to expand America's borders encourage nations like China, Israel, Ethiopia, and Venezuela to do the same? Personally, I am on Team Precedent does not matter, or at least it basically does not matter. Countries will do whatever they want to do, and they may cite precedent where it is convenient to do so, and ignore it otherwise. But that's just for crafting a narrative that may marginally influence some public opinions somewhere, but isn't going to be changing too many minds within the political organization of particular countries. And so, as a result, it's not really going to be changing very much what they actually choose to do. It's the joys of international relations and living in a state of anarchy. You can do whatever you want. Laws are laws and may or may not be followed based on whether countries want to do it or not. And they don't need the implicit permission, so to speak, as it were, of precedent to choose to do those sorts of things. If they want to do it, they'll do it. If they don't want to do it, they won't do it. Are there any Trump policies or decisions that you are particularly interested in for their potential to either challenge or reinforce prevailing academic theory? This question comes from Blue Sky. Thank you very much for it, and follow me over there. Yes, there is one in particular that I am interested in thinking more about that really dates back to 8 years ago and is just going to be a repeat of that now with 4 more years of Trump. It's called hegemonic provision of public goods. This is an idea that dates back 40 or 50 years ago. The basic premise is that the production of public goods in international relations is difficult because we do not have enforceable contracts. We can't just say, hey, stop littering, and if you don't stop littering, we're going to arrest you or fine you, because we don't have an international police that is capable of doing those sorts of things. Well, this theory from 40 or 50 years ago suggests that it is easier to get public goods to be produced when you have a big, strong country that is going to disproportionately benefit from that public good being produced. They internalize a lot of the benefit, and thus they are willing to incur the costs to produce it that smaller countries individually would be unwilling to do, and may have difficulties doing that collectively as a consequence of collective action problems when it comes to the production of public goods. The way that we were seeing this during Trump's first term, and we're already starting to see the repeat of it now, is specifically with NATO. That the United States is the big, strong actor in there, and the United States has disproportionately paid a price to get a baseline level of military strength within that alliance. And Trump has been very frustrated about that. You hear it all the time during the first term about meeting that 2% goal. In the 2 months since Trump was elected, we've started hearing even larger target percentages of GDP spending on defense that Trump is now really trying to promote. Part of this, I think, obviously, is just Trump really wanting Europe to pay more, to not free ride as much, and making threats to withdraw as a consequence. So the real test of this sort of theory is what happens if the European Union or the European countries are less willing to produce defense levels at what Trump wants. If after that the United States pulls out, do you see a breakdown in the geopolitical order that has more or less defined, especially the post-Cold War period? Or after the United States withdraws, do you then start seeing the European countries increasing their levels of public goods provision to compensate for the loss of the United States? And I don't think it's crazy to think that that could happen. You have the European Union as some sort of governmental infrastructure that is designed to try to resolve those sorts of problems. But they are not as active in the military setting because NATO is the chief organization that is supposed to be dedicated toward those sorts of affairs. So it would be interesting to see how this would play out if there is that sort of withdrawal from the European theater by the United States. But if I had to guess ahead of time about what's probably more likely to happen, is that Trump is still going to keep trudging along with the United States cooperation in NATO and is just going to be trying to, turn the screws over and over and over again on Europe to get Europe to spend more, but not actually have the United States withdraw, which would be the real test of the theory. So there is something out there that would be interesting, but I don't think we're actually going to see it happen in practice. With J.D. Vance, rather than Mike Pence, presiding over the joint session of Congress in 4 years' time, how would a future U.S. civil conflict resulting from an executive branch obstruction of the next president's certification affect ongoing and potential conflicts across the globe? Assume that international relations still remain relatively aligned to the current status quo by then. To generalize this question, I don't think it matters particularly how a potential U.S. civil conflict would begin in terms of the consequences for what will happen worldwide. If the United States withdraws, because the United States is in the middle of a civil conflict, you're going to have big problems for two different reasons. The first obvious problem is that the U.S. withdrawal itself causes a dearth of public goods being provided, going back to the previous question. And that's bad for the stability of international relations because you're going to have a lot of other countries that disagree with what the United States has promoted over the last, especially 30 years post-Cold War, trying to make changes associated with that. So if you are interested in global stability, that's bad for that reason. But it's much, much worse than it appears just looking at that, because you run into a problem where there's an incentive to have a war of opportunism. We talk about this sort of thing when we're looking at lines on maps theory all the time, where if there is a short-term change to the balance of power that is not going to persist in the long run, then those countries that are trying to do things to take advantage of the U.S. weakness can't just go ahead and take it and feel like they can confidently keep it for the long run. Because if the United States is going to become more powerful over time as the United States resolves its civil conflict and then reemerges on the international stage, those other countries are going to feel compelled to try to entrench themselves and use their military forces to lock in those goods over the long run. So it's not just a change in what we will be seeing with the status quo. It's that the way that the status quo is going to be changed is going to have to be, in order for it to stick in the long run, more militaristic, which means even more instability associated with that. With Trump being so aggressive toward our allies again, Do you think we can still rely on Allied intervention in the case of a war with China? Yes. The reason being is that the catalyst for a war with China, in all likelihood, would be the invasion of Taiwan. And every country involved in the Western economy, so thinking about East Asian allies, thinking about NATO, thinking about North America, every single one of those countries cares a whole bunch about semiconductors and would be terrified about China invading Taiwan. Doesn't matter about how they feel about the United States, whether they are annoyed with diplomatic belligerency from the United States, they care about semiconductors. And so if the United States is trying to fight back against China and keep Taiwan standing, they're going to want to participate as well to some degree, not talking about this at the same level as the United States bringing its navy to Taiwan, but European allies, East Asian allies, they're all going to want to participate to some degree because they care about the semiconductor manufacturing and they're doing it for themselves. They're not doing it as a favor to the United States or the Trump administration. Do you think Trump's second term will be more earth-shattering than the last? Or do you think it will be a less important chapter in American political history? I think the thing that's going against an earth-shattering term is the fact that we're all kind of used to it at this point. We've had 4 years of Trump already, and certainly by year 3 or 4, we all got used to Trump as a president. We all understood how he conducts himself inside of the Oval Office, and things became just less surprising and more mundane in the second half of Trump's first term. And so my anticipation going into the second term is because we're all just sort of used to it at this point. It's not going to feel as earth-shattering as the first term, even if it's just a replication of what we've seen 8 years ago, copied and pasted now into the second term. Now, there are a couple of other things that are important here. One is that, as we talked about before, Trump's a lame duck, and so there's going to be less congressional buy-in or less incentives for congressional buy-in as a consequence of that, which might work against him. But it's also the case that Trump, being a lame duck, no longer has an electoral check on himself. And so things could get really interesting in that last couple of years after the 2026 midterm elections, where there's no constraint on what Trump is facing in terms of legislative checks in that second term, the second half of the second term, which means that there could be more interesting things that he tries to do. And so if there are going to be a more earth-shattering set of moments that happen in the Trump administration as compared to the first term, I would expect it not in the next couple of years, but in the last couple of years of his term. We'll have to see. Is there any chance, likely from purely economic reasons, the Trump administration will give some economic incentives for people to move from natural disaster-riddled places like parts of Florida to elsewhere? Even if everything is privately owned, it's bad for the country's economy if parts of the country randomly stop working and have to be rebuilt over and over. Yeah, well, this has been tried. Administration after administration tries to create incentives like that, and it usually goes nowhere, which is why we keep seeing problems with hurricanes and flooding, and now, more prominently, with literally what's happening right now, wildfires in California. Now, the one thing that might be going for something actually happening this time around is that this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem within the United States over time. There are more natural disasters that create these sorts of issues. And as this question is pointing out, it's not just a problem for the individual. The fact that oftentimes the way that this plays out is that the US government bails out those individuals. That means all of us socially in the United States are incurring the risks associated with those natural disasters, even if we're not internalizing the benefits of having houses in those particular locations. And then there are also the second order effects, again, as this question is pointing out, that when you do have an economic crisis as a consequence of a natural disaster, that has spillover effects along production lines and that sort of thing that affect individuals that are not directly in the areas where the natural disaster is occurring. But like I said, lots of that has been attempted before, and not a lot of actual change has happened as a consequence. Maybe it'll be different this time, but I don't think that there's any reason necessarily to be optimistic about it happening. Do you think anything will actually happen with what Elon Musk is talking about, the Department of Government Efficiency and whatnot? I would actually love if Trump unexpectedly gives Musk money to build one of his bonkers projects, like the Hyperloop, just so that everyone can see in practice how bonkers it is. Well, I think DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, I think they're going to find things. I think that when you put enough effort, there's a lot of effort that's going to be put in by this administration as compared to previous administrations to look for these sorts of things. And when you have an organization as large as the United States government is, they're going to find things. It's almost impossible that things that are blatantly inefficient and bad don't exist in the US government. It's absurd to think that nothing like that exists anywhere. And they're going to find those sorts of things. They're going to bring them to light. There's going to be broad public support for change. There is going to be congressional support for that as well. And obviously, the Trump administration is going to be for it. And so there are going to be substantive changes that will happen as a consequence of the Department of Government Efficiency. I don't think that that should be particularly controversial, although we will see in the comments about whether there is consensus and agreement about that particular point. Now, that being said, I think the modal outcome that we're going to see with recommendations from Doge is something along the following. There is a particular widget that the US government needs to be produced, and the way that we go about doing that is have 8 different factories in 8 different states produce that thing. Doge is going to find this. It's going to point out this is really inefficient. It would be much more efficient if we centralized production at just one of those facilities. We close down the 7 worst performing. We keep that one that's best performing. We expand it. We hire more. We then produce that widget just in that one facility, and we'll save tons of money as a consequence of that. And what Doge is going to learn very quickly is that when you do that, you're going to have 14 bipartisan senators, 2 senators from each of the 7 states where the factories are being shut down, that are going to be very angry about this sort of thing. Reason being is that those jobs are going to be lost. Any businesses that are tied to those jobs are also going to be shuttered, and there are going to be jobs that are lost that are associated with those as well. And those people are voters, and those voters might take it out on those senators come election time. And that's something that those senators want to avoid. And as a consequence of that, there is not going to be nearly as much change as you might think that there's going to be, because you have people that are entrenched in status quo positions. They have political support from their senators, and those senators, and also the members of the House of Representatives as well, are not going to be supportive of making changes to that. And there's a lot of things that exist like that in the US government, because that is oftentimes how you get bills passed. You might have to put in some sort of stipulation that there's going to be some construction here, here, and here to pass votes, to get votes from those people that are associated with those particular areas to get past the threshold that you need to get that legislation through the House and through the Senate. And once those things exist, they're really hard to take back. So yeah, I think Doge is going to do something, but they're also going to find out that the constraints behind government are a little bit more difficult to try to relax than you would otherwise hope. And I think that this is a fun way to end today's video. So I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time. Take care.